In recent years, there's been a noticeable interest in developing forms of naturalism in philosophy that depart from the orthodox characterization, which defends a privileged place for the natural sciences. A key motivation for elaborating forms of so-called liberal naturalism, which is a term I think first introduced by John McDowell, although it comes in various versions nowadays for relaxed naturalism, expansive naturalism, Catholic naturalism with a small c, and many others. So I'll be using this term in a sort of general sense as something that contrasts with orthodox scientific naturalism, as it's usually understood. So a key motivation for elaborating these alternative forms of naturalism is to account for normative phenomena essential to our thought, discourse, and agency, without first assuming the scientifically described world into which normative phenomena need to be placed or located. So a typical way of approaching this problem is to think of the world as it's described by the natural sciences, excuse me, and then say, right, so how are we going to place or locate normativity quite generally into that kind of world? So that's quite often the setup of the dialectic. Normative phenomena include reasons and intentionality and expressions of our rational agency. And such phenomena also incorporate forms of action, meaning, and understanding that cannot be exclusively articulated in rational or epistemological terms, but are presupposed by them. Wittgenstein was clearly preoccupied with such things, but his relation to naturalism is less easy to characterize. So in what follows, I address Wittgenstein's contribution, or some of his contributions at least, to framing thought's embodied character. One outcome, hopefully, is that it helps reveal how the relevant normativity is understood naturalistically, and so demonstrating against some influential interpretations how the challenge of reconciling, or so-called reconciling, the realm of nature with the realm of normativity can be addressed. And to appreciate the significance of this, our understanding of normativity must accommodate at least some of what Wittgenstein regards as the non-rational bedrock of our cognitive and practical lives. So very often, normativity is one of those pretty tricky philosophical terms that is always mentioned and is always talked about, but it's very difficult to give an uncontroversial and sort of nice and pithy definition or characterization of what it is. But very often, it at least incorporates talk of reasons. It's closely aligned with reasons of our practices of looking for reasons, giving reasons, asking for reasons, and explaining events in light of reasons, acting because of reasons, and so on and so forth. And for some people, the concept of a reason is the fundamental normative concept. Reasons play an important and wide-ranging role, of course, in our theoretical and practical lives, and are considered a vital component in achieving and attributing knowledge. So, famously, Wilfrid Sellars proposed that in order for an episode or state, as he said, to count as instances of knowledge, a so-called logical space of reasons is required in which to situate such instances. Contrasting with a non-normative or empirical description, in his terms, of a putative knowledge state, genuine knowledge is characterized by adequately placing it in the space of reasons. A successful placement would imply, we're told, that a person is thus being justified and being able to justify their claims. And accordingly, for a person to know involves them adopting a normative status and stance in this space of reasons, one that is secured by the presence of reasons that justify their claims and by reasons being available to that person in order to provide justifications. The contrast between the activity of empirical description with that of placing in the space of reasons is a contrast drawn in part to expose the incoherence of trying to characterize in non-normative terms what is essentially a normative phenomenon, that is knowledge. Interpretations of Sellars on this point differ as to just what the relevant contrast is constituted by. So one of the differences in interpretation of this idea is what the supposed contrast with the space of reasons is supposed to be. So, for example, Rorty talks about what lies on the other side of the space of reasons as the space of causal relations to objects. and an interpretation that's kind of disputed, I guess, by McDowell, who prefers this phrase, the realm of law, in contrast to the space of reasons. And other writers complain that the space of reasons metaphor has become overly dominant in contemporary, or at least recent, philosophy. So, for example, Simon Blackburn writes that those distinguishing between the space of reasons and what he calls the space of causation is intended in quite a problematic way to be dualistic. The space of reasons is a context in which we can enjoy content, intentionality, inference, and judgment, for instance, a space which we are moved because of logos, according to Blackburn. And Blackburn adds that those philosophers who celebrate the space of reasons regard it as the entire space of the mind, as he puts it, and a space that is hermetically sealed, such that nothing that is not a reason belongs there. As such, these two spaces are divided by an unbridgeable gap that threatens to make unintelligible any link between events conceived as intentional and events conceived as lying in the space of causes, as Blackburn puts it. So the problem, Blackburn thinks, is not just that this results in an intractable dualism. The intention lying behind the metaphor of the two spaces, space of reasons metaphor on the one hand and the space of causation, as he puts it, on the other, the intention lying behind the metaphor of the two spaces is also ideological. It is, he says, to forewarn against naturalism, since naturalism is principally the view that, quote, the natural order is the causal order, according to Blackburn, and that there is no unbridgeable gap between what happens in that order and any other order in heaven or earth, including the order of our own minds. So on Blackburn's understanding, indulging the space of reasons metaphor as that realm in which we make sense of normativity commits one to a form of anti-naturalism. And insisting on the idea that the space of reasons is the exclusive space in which we can make sense of intentionality and normativity more broadly, as opposed to the space of causes or the space of nature, is then a move against naturalism. And since the metaphor allegedly insists on the gap, the daunting challenge for those who employ it is then to work out how normativity and naturalism can be reconciled. One way to try and meet this challenge is to approach it as a metaphysical task that is trying to so-called place normativity in a natural world, as Blackburn puts it. So an approach allegedly shown to be needless, he thinks, Blackburn, by appeal to Wittgenstein. So the metaphysical approach, according to Blackburn, seeks to find room in the natural world for reasons, intentionality, mindedness, and so on. And so to populate the world with normative features to which our thought, language, and actions are then seen as directed, and to which they are genuinely responsive. Blackburn takes Wittgenstein as an ally against the metaphysicians, who regard the only way to secure our right to talk of normativity is to employ the rhetoric of perception and detection and revelation and so on. The relevant normative phenomena are not exhausted by the fabled queer properties lamented by Mackie and the associated realist metaphysics and epistemology ingrained in ordinary life. Intentionality, for example, is a relevant normative phenomena, but we're not receptive to it, perhaps, in exactly the same way that we may be receptive to, say, a normative requirement such as to stop on red. Nevertheless, intentionality as a normative phenomena would still need to be placed in the natural world according to this metaphysical approach that Blackburn thinks that Wittgenstein helps us in avoiding. So an alternative to the metaphysical strategy here is to account for normativity not by trying to place it in the natural world, but by explaining its role in our linguistic and associated cognitive practices. This alternative is, as we might interpret it, apparently less metaphysical and more humanistic. So a strategy that refuses to bifurcate the realm of normativity on the one hand and the natural world on the other. This is a policy that Blackburn regards Wittgenstein to uphold. Very briefly put, to account for normativity by avoiding so-called metaphysics and remaining at the level of our practices and our language games. I think there are at least two elements that need addressing. Firstly, the dualism, I think, is misleading. One of the lessons of the kind of naturalism expressed in Wittgenstein's work, I think, is resistance to precisely the scientific naturalism that identifies the natural order with the causal order. Blackburn assumes that invoking the space of reasons signals a retreat from embracing naturalism as such. So an implication is that reasons and normativity quite generally and the world are opposed somehow, one being capable of a naturalistic description, the other having a non-naturalistic status, lying as it does, we're told, on the other side of an unbridgeable gap. The idea that we should avoid an unbridgeable gap can seem importantly right. But in this context, avoiding that is not determined by whether or not we embrace scientific naturalism. The idea that something like the order of our own minds is not expelled from nature is also importantly right, I think. But again, being able to deny the expulsion is not determined by whether or not we embrace naturalism. Secondly, and relatedly, Blackburn's dualistic metaphor, to which his Wittgenstein is directed, fails to accommodate how the latter's insights about our enacted understanding, our forms of embodied certainty, articulate ways of being that are possible only because of normative contexts that are naturalistically instantiated. So for this talk now, I propose to characterize this below as Wittgenstein's account of embodied normativity. Blackburn, I think, rightly portrays the dualism between normativity and nature as problematic, but he also presupposes a version of it in order to wield what he takes as Wittgenstein's anti-metaphysics to recommend that accounting for normativity can be exhaustively achieved on our side of the norm-nature distinction. Doing so helps deflate our use of the terms, as I said earlier, or the rhetoric of detection or seeing or revelation, and to articulate our apparent answerability to the normatively configured independent world. Rather, once domesticated, our talk in these terms becomes metaphysically anodyne. That is consistent with scientific naturalism, because there is no longer the urge to locate or place the grounds of normative discourse in the world. We do not need then to inflate our metaphysics such that we regard ourselves as taking in normative features of reality in our experience and thought. The relevant domestication involves identifying what serves to discipline normative thought, discourse, and agency as lying within our linguistic practices, and so not as involving contact with normative features of the world, or indeed the normative world more generally. So, those who like to indulge the dualistic metaphor, according to Blackburn, regard the space of normativity as coextensive in a problematic way with the describable world. And in its original Salesian formulation, the normativity essential to the space of reasons involved clarifying cases in which we properly say of S that she knows. In such cases, S's mind is guided by reasons such that S is in fact justified in what she claims, and is also able to supply a justificatory narrative. In Blackburn's use of the space of reasons, it takes on a meaning with metaphysical and anti-naturalist intent, according to him. Now, one of the salient issues, I think, here is the attempt to present Wittgenstein as opposing the idea that the world is normative. It couldn't be right to regard Wittgenstein as set against the idea of a dualistic picture that Blackburn targets. But I think what we can take Wittgenstein to offer as a response is not straightforward, and it is not, at least in my view, what Blackburn suggests. So consider the passages and these quotations this one and others that I'll be using are very well known to everyone, I imagine. But consider the passages in investigations where Wittgenstein is trying to clarify what following a rule involves. So at section 217, he writes, he asks the question, how am I able to obey a rule? If this is not a question about causes, he says, then it is about the justification for my following the rule in the way that I do. Now, translated into the context of Blackburn's dualism, Wittgenstein's question is asking then whether obeying a rule is made intelligible as an occurrence in the space of reasons or as an occurrence in the space of causes. Or alternatively, it is a question about whether rule following is a normative or a causal phenomenon. But the alternative is not equivalent, however, since the meanings of justification and normative are not coextensive. So Wittgenstein considers the question, initially at least, as one about justification and reflects on the practice of providing justifications or reasons for following a rule. He then writes that if I have exhausted the justifications, if I'm asked to provide them for following in the rule or acting in the way that I do, I've reached bedrock, he famously says, and my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do. And we can ask whether whatever it is that Wittgenstein is indicating by the phrase, what I do, is best understood as an occurrence in the space of reasons or the space of causes. But I think there's reasons to think that what is indicated cannot be understood as either in the space of reasons or the space of causes. Yet, importantly, neither can it be understood in non-normative terms. So the overall lesson is that we need to think of normativity, think of meaning in a way that extends more broadly than what can be captured in the structure of the space of reasons. So in that sense, normativity and justification come apart. Since we ought to interpret the activity of doing what I do as in some sense non-rational or unreasonable, as some people sometimes refer to it as. And if I use the term unreasonable, that's not, of course, in a moral sense. It just means that it's outside of the operation of rationality, or can't be rationalized, or the relevant object can't be rationalized in perhaps the usual way. We ought to interpret the activity of doing what I do as unreasonable in this sense, but no less normative because of that. In the absence of justification, as in cases where, quote from Wittgenstein, the chain of reasons has ended, doing what I do is an instance of human agency that does not somehow have its normativity removed because of its unreasonable or non-rational character. Compare Wittgenstein's claim that a person unable to provide reasons and justifications for their expressions or their actions is not thereby producing non-normative utterances. Such a person may use a word without right, as he puts it, even if they use it without justification. And this has a significant implication, I think, for how we regard the nature of the bedrock as lying beyond justification, but as irreducibly normative. And I'll come back to this point a little bit in a sec. Indicating what a person simply does in the present sense, and describing a person's word use that is not justified, yet rightful, are not wholly independent cases of the wider sense of normativity that I'm gesturing at. Both are examples of human agency that quite literally embody a form of certainty, for example. Such certainty, again, as is well known, such certainty Wittgenstein describes as basic and objective, in contrast to a state of complete conviction, as he puts it, which constitutes subjective certainty. Objective certainty is neither psychological nor epistemic, since it again, famously, lies beyond being justified or unjustified. The fundamental character of objective certainty is revealed through our action, which is the pre-rational basis for the development of propositional thought and language, at least understood in one way. At this level of embodied animal certainty, as Wittgenstein puts it, our instinct is the ground on which more reflective forms of thought and language are anchored. Wittgenstein asks why I do not satisfy myself that I have 2 feet when I want to get up from a chair. And he replies, there is no I simply don't. This is how I act. Such activity does not require a prior stage of coming to explicitly know that one possesses feet in order then to employ that knowledge in action. The instinct highlighted by Wittgenstein in Uncertainty, at least, articulates in part what is meant by his describing our following a rule in investigations as our acting blindly. In the context, Wittgenstein contrasts this with choosing to obey a rule which would imply an act of reflective consideration and endorsement. It may be, in cases, that a person is able to provide reasons for their rule-following actions, but reasons will soon give out, as he tells us, Wittgenstein, and at that point there will be acting without reasons. Such acting is blind, perhaps in the current sense, but not arbitrary and not radically unconstrained action, but norm-governed, contextualized action, a form of embodied certainty beyond reasons and justifications, yet nevertheless manifested with right. Some commentators have characterized this or form of this pre-rational certainty in terms of trust, which I know is very important to Daniel's interpretation. And there are reasons, I think, to be sympathetic to this view, not least because it's how Wittgenstein himself describes at least some forms of basic certainty. According to Wittgenstein, these certainties, which are groundless in the sense that they are unsupported by reasons or justifications, nevertheless constitute the bedrock from which our practical and cognitive lives are shaped. A bedrock which is described occasionally as a form of belief. Again, famously, at the foundation of well-founded belief lies belief that is not founded. And just to prefigure a few brief remarks that I'll make about Hume later, there are these different understandings that Wittgenstein has or expresses of what we can mean by belief, and indeed what we do mean by belief. And I think something importantly very similar happens in the case of Hume as well, which is kind of contrary to, I think, the usual interpretations of Hume on belief and cognition that have extremely narrow, very specific, unusually narrow interpretation of what we should mean by belief. But I'll come back to that later. What lies, excuse me, at the foundation of well-founded belief, one kind of belief, lies another kind of belief. Yet embodied basic certainty is inhabited and is visceral, as Marie McGinn puts it, rather than as an outcome of explicit judgment, or perhaps maybe the usual understanding that philosophers have of belief, but how that can pair with that kind of explicit judgment. Wittgenstein remarks that primitive certainty, lying as it does beyond being justified or unjustified, as it were something animal, that kind of certainty is not meant to refer to something non-human, but as something that provides the conditions such that a person can be justified and can perhaps explicitly rationalize or endorse their claims and other actions. Primitive certainty is a normative mode of action that cannot be characterized as occupying a position in the space of reasons, since it is presupposed by it. Our basic way of embodying certainty is not, Wittgenstein tells us, a form of intellectual recognition or insight, into what constitutes the bedrock of our practices. Rather, what lies at the bottom is our acting. Now, some interpret these and similar remarks and Wittgenstein's general anti-representationalism as evidence of his inactivism. Inactivist interpretations emphasize the pervasive and primitive role of action in Wittgenstein's treatment of thought and language, through which action regains, as Danielle says, its rightful place in the description of our human-mindedness. For inactivists, there is no way to portray mindedness other than elucidating how we dynamically engage with our environment in ways that ground the development of higher forms of intellectual activity, according to some. Now, the point I'm really trying to make is not mortgaged on whether it is correct to describe Wittgenstein as an inactivist or to get clear exactly what Wittgenstein's relation to contemporary forms of inactivism might be. What I want to highlight is what I take to be a kind of inactivist motivation, or the sort of guiding spirit with regard to how we picture the primitive relation between our minds and the world. So a stance which prioritizes the embodied and embedded nature of mindedness, according to which our lives involve already inhabiting a world which is grounded in action. So on the horizon is the move against sort of Blackburn's attempt to use Wittgenstein to say, look, we shouldn't be talking about the world as genuinely containing normative features, or to talk about the world as something to which we respond normatively. And actually, we can account for normativity by happily staying on our side of the mind-world distinction, because it's kind of metaphysically too outrageous or unsupportable to talk about the world itself as being a normative context, which would kind of fall foul of the strictures of what passes as contemporary scientific naturalism. Okay, so the idea is that once we refuse to see scientific naturalism as setting the agenda, then there is other opportunities to think naturalistically about the context of the world in which we enjoy mindedness, and we can have our linguistic and practical, rational and non-rational practices. So this is a basic inactivist kind of, as I say, guiding spirit, which pictures the primitive relation between our minds and the world as central, and prioritizes or privileges the embodied and embedded nature of mindedness, where that is characterized in ways that acknowledge how we already inhabit a world that's grounded in action and is also normative. So emphasizing the embodied character of basic certainty and understanding helps to consolidate the idea, I think, that the bedrock, the bottom of our language gains, is a normative context of activity. As stated, normativity is required to make sense of the idea that a person can act without reasons or justification, yet properly said to be following a rule, to act, that is, with right. In McDowell's terms, Wittgenstein's insistence that blind action is not without right is there, he says, in order to prevent the leaching out of norms from our picture of bedrock, from our picture, that is, of how things are, McDowell says, at the deepest level. So again, that could be a form of expressing the idea that we need to be more capacious in thinking about what constitutes normativity than restricting it to forms of rationality, giving reasons, asking for reasons, acting in light of reasons, inhabiting the space of reasons more generally. If the bedrock, what is taken for granted by the activity of giving and asking for reasons, were somehow non-normative, then we would have a partial version of the myth of the given, which underpins some of what Sellers proposes in terms of picturing knowledge as a stance in the space of reasons in order to address this problematic understanding of how experience relates to knowledge, such that these we can achieve something normative, that is to say, knowledge or a stance in the space of reasons, out of something that's non-normative, which usually goes by the name of sense data or qualia, or some version of a unit of experience according to traditional foundationalist empiricism. But the general kind of frame of the myth of the given is the challenge or the difficulty or the impossibility, if you think that it's right to describe it as a myth, of extracting something normative from something that is essentially non-normative. For many people, that's just not going to work. So if this bedrock is non-normative, then the question posed in terms of at least the setup of Sellers is to ask, well, how is normativity going to arise from what is essentially non-normative? It would be a partial version of the myth of the given. The incoherent idea, as I say, that what possesses justificatory or normative potential can arise from grounds that are essentially non-normative. I say partial here because, for the reasons suggested earlier, the normativity with which Wittgenstein characterizes the basic context is not the same as it is for Sellers. For Sellers, what avoids the myth of the given is characterizing knowledge in the space of reasons and rethinking the nature of how it is that we enjoy ordinary experience. Wittgenstein's bedrock normativity is non-rational or unreasonable in the sense used earlier. An action manifesting at the bedrock cannot be captured in causal mechanical terms on pain of allowing these norms to leach out, in McDowell's sense. But as I've been suggesting, preventing the loss of norms from our picture of bedrock is not secured by portraying the bedrock in terms suitable for the space of reasons. Wittgenstein is explicit that being justified and being able to justify what one says take for granted a pre-rational context of embodied certainty and understanding. And acknowledging the normative and unreasonable context within which our basic certainties are enabled has a significant implication, I think, for the relation between normativity and naturalism. Usually, the challenge is cast as one of seeking ways to naturalize normativity, where that means something like assuming an account of the world as described by the natural sciences and then proceeding to explain normative features of our lives in light of that account. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is the challenge that's being described as that of placing normativity in the world. And that kind of rhetoric of placing or locating is seen in kind of numerous different places. Frank Jackson talks about the location problem. Hugh Price talks about the placement problem. Blackburn in other places, in ethics, for example, describes how the fundamental challenge for moral philosophers is to find room in the natural world for ethics. Or as he puts it, the fundamental problem for us as moral philosophers, if we're moral philosophers or any philosopher, is to find room in the disenchanted world, because that's the world that fundamentally we inhabit. The world that's disenchanted, to use Weber's phrase, that's the conception of the world that's drained of meaning, drained of normativity, picture of the world that emerges from the natural sciences. So this idea of the placement problem, the location problem, or finding room problem, as it were, takes for granted the primacy of a naturalist or orthodox naturalistic picture of the nature of the world. But for Wittgenstein, the construal of meaning, understanding, and knowing in normative terms is in tension with naturalism only given a prior and unwarranted bifurcation between what is natural and what is normative. There are considerations that support characterizing Wittgenstein as a liberal naturalist, perhaps, as a way of providing some substance to, again, McGinn's assertion that naturalism, as she says, is, quote, fundamental to Wittgenstein's philosophical method. A number of remarks signify the emphasis that Wittgenstein puts on our ordinary and natural patterns of thought, practice, and agency, patterns that constitute the natural historical character of humanity and of our humanity. So, again, as is well known, he puts it in the investigations, commanding, questioning, recounting, chatting are as much part of our natural history as walking, eating, drinking, and playing. And it is worth noting a parallel here, as I mentioned earlier, with Hume, who has expressed, in my view, forms of naturalism that go well beyond orthodox scientific versions. So, for example, in this context of Wittgenstein kind of gathering together these different activities that we do, that on the face of it seem to be perhaps quite different in some sense, are part of our so-called natural history, that Hume suggests at one point that nature has determined us to judge as well as to breathe and feel. So combining or recognizing the sort of holistic character of judgment, which we may say, well, that's a clear expression of a rational capacity. Breathing may be an expression of quite a different capacity, and feeling, if that's to be interpreted as some sort of cognitive state or some sort of emotion, is again another kind of capacity. But Hume has this sort of overarching naturalism within which he thinks, at least, we can account for all sorts of things, ranging from the much more rational to the much less rational. And this is part, again, in my view, and it's not just my view, right, but it is my view, that it's part of a much richer conception of naturalism that some have recognized in Hume. So when Hume describes, or I suppose it's very usual and commonplace to understand Humean naturalism to be kind of hyper-psychologistic, laying the foundations for what would become the disenchanted world of Max Weber, and the idea of the picture of the world that's criticized by those different forms of liberal naturalists and people like that. But I think there's something much more interesting going on in Hume, and in ways that can really help illuminate some of what Wittgenstein is trying to do. The clear differences, of course, but I think that there's a very intriguing relation that's yet to be fully appreciated. So at the beginning of the treatise, Hume describes what he takes to be the science, what he describes as the science of man, or the science of human nature. Okay, what is that? Well, this is how he describes it. Hume says that we must glean up our experiments in this science, the science of man, or the science of human nature, from, he says, the cautious observation of human life, and take them as they appear in the common course of the world, by men's behaviour in company, in affairs, and in their pleasures. And it's worth just holding, I think, in our minds, the primary place that Hume gives to his entire philosophical method, it seems, as it's described. This is right in the introduction of the treatise, of the science of human nature to be based on the cautious observation of human life. All of the other sciences, he says, take for granted what this science of human nature is. So all the other sciences, in some sense, take for granted this idea of the cautious observation of human life, which is quite unlike, it would seem, how Hume is often regarded in the context of any discussion of naturalism and normativity by, for example, philosophers indeed like McDowell, who have done more than most to try and promote forms of non-scientific, or certainly non-scientistic or non-reductionist forms of naturalism, that he describes Hume as the prophet of disenchantment, where Hume's world is like an ineffable lump, devoid of structure and order, McDowell says. And there are passages where, perhaps Hume implies that's what he takes for granted, but there are at least as many, if not more, instances where Hume's world and the investigation of us in our world and our world is much richer than perhaps is usually assumed. But Wittgenstein, in any case, is suggesting with the chatting, the eating, and the walking, that under the concept of natural history are collected a variety of actions, practices, and forms of thought, a variety that includes features that fall more towards the perhaps physiological end of some spectrum and others towards the more anthropological or normative end. A mistake that Wittgenstein tries to expose is that of treating those natural, ordinary features grounded in physiological necessity or something like that, and others visible from an exclusively causal scientific point of view, as if they were basic to what it is to understand ourselves. For Wittgenstein, the cooperation of walking and eating with questioning and chatting is an expression of the idea that we ought to treat these holistically. It is the idea later expressed by others, again, like McDowell, who propose regarding the normative holistically together with patterns of behavior characterizable from a more detached perspective. So as McDowell puts it, a res cogitans is also a res ambulans. I've been suggesting that a core element in Wittgenstein's naturalism is his insistence on the basic status of our embodiment and agency. And I've also tried to suggest that it is appropriate to construe this as an expression of so-called liberal naturalism, or some version of liberal naturalism. But the links between emphasizing a kind of Wittgensteinian inactivism and liberal naturalism are contested. Specifically, some commentators who regard inactivism as a helpful way to elucidate Wittgenstein's philosophy of mind, nevertheless regard the holism in question to be potentially threatening by characterizing it as a form of liberal naturalism. So, for example, Hutto and Satney describe liberal naturalism in recoiling in an extreme way, they say, from scientific naturalism, ends up with an out-of-control metaphysics. So a bloated and overpopulated ontology, they say. So that's the concern. So where kind of liberalization involves inflation, the inappropriate sort of inflation of something. So the worry here is that the process of liberalization proceeds with an insufficiently principled account of what does and what does not count as natural. An alleged result because of the attempt to propose a form of naturalism, quote, without the backing of the sciences. So they suggest that one reason is because liberal naturalism produces its own kind of unbridgeable gap of the sort criticised by Blackburn, you remember, and challenged by Wittgenstein. On their reading, liberal naturalism divides nature into two realms, each inspired by the scientific and the manifest image of the world, again to borrow from Sellers, with no compelling account of how these domains are or can be related. For the purposes of clarifying Wittgenstein's naturalism, they emphasize its liberating rather than its liberal character. And they detect in McDowell's liberal naturalism the influence of a distinctively philosophical or theoretical picture of what ordinary practices of meaning and understanding amount to. A picture which seemingly promotes the rather un-Wittgensteinian idea that grasping content involves meaning coming to mind. More broadly, they argue that a more appropriate naturalism to associate with Wittgenstein should resist what they take to be the liberals' urge to expand and ultimately bifurcate nature. Instead, a liberating naturalism is satisfied with, quote, a careful description of our practices that involve meaning and understanding. So, at least on the face of it, not radically different from what Hume is saying there about the cautious observation of human life. And that is a process which will not inflate nature so that it includes special normative facts, but rather places those facts in plain view. characterizing Wittgenstein as liberating is, I think, right in numerous ways. But whatever kind of naturalism is favored, it should not be endorsed because it has the so-called backing of the sciences. In my view, Wittgenstein's liberating naturalism is one way that his liberal naturalism is expressed. So perhaps we should avoid regarding liberal and scientific naturalism to be responsible for another intractable dualism, which in effect makes facing the placement problem in one form or another somehow inevitable. But liberal naturalism, again, some version of it, particularly in its Wittgensteinian form, need not attempt to expand nature. That would preserve the idea that orthodox scientific naturalism is basic. Rather, the value of liberal naturalism, at least in some forms, is that it exposes scientific naturalism as a restriction rather than vice versa. So there is room, presumably, to push back against the pressure of these criticisms that say that we're in danger of kind of inflating ontology or inflating what counts as natural, to say, well, that only really makes sense against the backdrop of a rather restrictive, kind of thin, perhaps thin, overly thin understanding of what counts as natural and naturalism. Wittgenstein's insistence on the importance of sensitivity to embodied contextual practice for philosophical inquiry and self-understanding is at odds with the aspiration to locate the patterns of our normative practices in and explain them in light of the scientifically described world, where I mean exclusively in light of the scientifically described world. So Wittgenstein can help us then to see how the task of placing normativity in a naturalistic world already assumes that normative features and practices have been expelled from the world to begin with. And that is something that Wittgenstein gives us reason to question. Attending to the relevant, quote, spatial and temporal phenomenon of language, as he puts it in the investigations, and more broadly, seeing our unreflective and instinctive agency as fundamental, serve a critical task through a therapeutic one. That is to say that Wittgenstein's naturalistic inquiry seeks to clarify what, again, Marie McGuinness described as natural phenomena in their natural setting, and in doing so illuminates the character and the boundaries of scientific naturalism. Wittgenstein's naturalism then does not recognize the placement problem. It is understood as incorporating a form of attention to ordinary life. And incorporating a form of attention to ordinary life, it lights a way to address the image still present in some lingering contemporary expressions of naturalism that our basic task is one of finding room or attempting to locate normativity in the world. What we learn from Wittgenstein, amongst other things, is that this image involves an initial act of detachment that holds the natural world apart from the world of meaning and normativity. Rather, the natural world is the ordinary world in which normativity already has its home. Emphasizing our basic inhabitation of the world through primitive action implies an alternative to conception of the world to that assumed then by orthodox scientific naturalism, an assumption that drains the world of normativity, as I said earlier, since it is and must be only because of our practices that normativity comes into existence in the first place. So Wittgenstein can't embrace a picture of the world according to at least one influential interpretation where the origins of normativity are to do with us rather than the world. And that's explained by a form of projection or a faculty of production that we have in our cognitive practices, such that, as Hume would say, in one mood, that we gild and stain the natural world with the colours borrowed from internal sentiment. So normativity is put into the world by us, rather than us being responsive to or finding normativity in the world in a different way. And that's something, this kind of projectivism is not something that Wittgenstein could embrace. It seems that for Wittgenstein, the natural world that we find ourselves in cannot be understood apart from its normative character. Accordingly, the world is the taken for granted context without which our thought and agency would be unintelligible, and is very much so not a realm that we posit on the basis of evidence or theory. In Uncertainty, Wittgenstein writes that I did not get my picture of the world by satisfying myself of its correctness, nor do I have it because I am satisfied of its correctness. It is the inherited background, he puts it. So discriminating between what is true and what is false, and inquiring and asserting more generally to, in light of what Wittgenstein says, and more broadly, any acts of cognition and rationality, these emerge from a more primitive mode of inhabiting the world, a primitive mode, and this primitive mode, and the rational activities it grounds cannot be non-normative, because that would be to assume an incoherent picture of how the normative materializes from a non-normative basis. But as I've been suggesting, the response need not be that we recast the primitive mode to incorporate rationality at the foundation. That would be to locate the space of logos, or the space of reasons, as fundamental in some sense. Whatever the credentials of this alternative, it doesn't seem to be Wittgenstein's view. So as indicated earlier, Wittgenstein regards as impoverished the disjunction between a causal and a rational account of our abilities to be guided by rules. What going by a rule really consists in, he says, cannot be revealed merely by noting that a person has been trained to react in a particular way. Rather, a custom is required. Relatedly, coming to grasp a world picture cannot be an individual achievement, but rather it is learned in the context of interpersonal regulation, the customs into which a person is inducted, which is contrasted with a conception of the world as a hypothesis. Again, a look at Hume is instructive as a helpful reminder, I think, of the naturalistic, normative, and pre-epistemic character of the interpersonal world. So very famously, at the end of book 1 of the Treatise of Human Nature, Hume describes the skeptical meltdown, where he's tried to find justification for our totally ordinary, commonplace beliefs in the existence of the external world, of causal relations and so on, and he can't find them. And this is a great cause of distress, it seems, genuine distress on his part. And he has this skeptical meltdown at the end of book 1 that's very famous. And this is how he describes it, and I won't spend too long kind of reading it all out, but he talks about this being confounded with a forlorn solitude. No one wants to hang around with me. It seems that my very thoughts become unsupported when other people fall away. And of course, what is really clear about this is not just a detached description of isn't it disappointing that rational justification can't be found? Oh well, it's actually all described in interpersonal terms. And then the solution to this problem, of course, is not more rationality, not more reasoning, not more philosophy, not more searching for reasons and justifications, because that's got him into the problem in the first place. It's seeing his friends, very famously, playing backgammon, conversing, eating, making merry, and so on and so forth. Again, the solution is entirely described, it seems, in interpersonal terms. Not just in terms that kind of refuse to engage in philosophy, but part of the project, it seems, of recognizing that what is underneath, or what the project of philosophy or skepticism or asking for reasons, that's how you want to describe it, what that presupposes is something more basic, which is ordinary life, ordinary interpersonal life, which is the sort of context within which those more sophisticated activities make sense in the first place. So the world as this inherited background is the enabling context of our everyday lives. I'm just coming to the end now. The largely tacit setting presupposed then by our ability to exercise rationality, and is thus presupposed by the distinction between the space of reasons and the space of causation. In this way, we can appreciate that the conception of normativity assumed by some, by Blackburn in his presentation of the dualistic metaphor, for example, is inadequate, it seems. It's perfectly right to say that the space of reasons is a normative space in which we have content, intentionality, inference, and judgment, and so on. But that space cannot exhaust what counts as normative for Wittgenstein. As I've argued, what counts as normative also incorporates the context in which we believe and act in ways unsupported by reasons and justifications, yet embodied and embedded in the ordinary, everyday world. This kind of non-rational normativity is inseparable from the naturalism that I think is present in Wittgenstein's work. So according to McGinn, at least one of Wittgenstein's aims is the clarification of complex natural phenomena in their natural setting, as I said, where these phenomena include our ordinary abilities to embody forms of agency already nested in an essentially normative world. But those things, Wittgenstein's aim, also helps us to understand the usually unmentioned normative bedrock of our lives. So Wittgenstein shows us then, at least partly, the way to understand how orthodox naturalism can generate or face what becomes known as the placement problem, because it already assumes that world as basic. And his insights about what I've been calling embodied normativity illuminate a way that the challenge can be addressed. By drawing attention to the realm of basic action and forms of embodied certainty, the position from which the challenge appears in the first place is revealed, in either case, to presuppose a more fundamental context of our lives. This context can neither be rendered into the conceptual register of the space of reasons, nor the space of causation. The naturalism expressed through Wittgenstein's alternative is a reminder, I think, that normativity and the natural world are primitively united. Okay, that's me done.